A wise man once said, the future belongs to those who are working hard today. I then asked myself the very question, what is the future of Africa? What is the future of the black continent? What is the future of the black race? My name is Efosa Osaro. I'm the author of Osaro Theory, and you are listening to Osaro Theory Podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Osaro Theory Podcast. This is episode 4, titled Emotional Reservoir. So, what is emotional reservoir? Emotional reservoir is a reservoir of energy that humans absorb from the sun. The Osaro Theory posited that people who live in tropical geographical climate possesses or absorb more emotion than those who live in a colder climate, like that of Europe and Asia. For example, Africans who live in tropical conditions are more genetically emotional than Europeans and Asians. That was posited in Osaro Theory, a book I published in the UK in 2019. So my theory was basically try to study the differences of emotion in races between the blacks, Asians, and Europeans. How do I come to understand this emotional reservoir? And on my discovery, what I find out or what I come to discover, in order for me to understand why certain behaviors are different between races, I discovered that blacks who evolved from Africa behave more emotional, more energetic than the Europeans and Asians. When you study the Europeans and the Asians, when you pay attention to particular behavior, you find that Europeans are very laid back, very reserved, very collective, and I would say they're very reflective in their actions, And the more you go up north, in places like Denmark or Sweden, I went when I was conducting this research, I found out that the Swedish and the Danish are very cold in terms of behavior than people from Western Europe, like Italy or Spain. Even the Netherlands, the Germans are more warm in behavior than the Danish or Swedish or even the Russians. So I was conducting my research and trying to understand why these behavioral differences between European countries. And on my discovery, what I realized is that the more people are closer to the equator, like that of Africa, or places where a tropical environment, or the Caribbean, places like that is very hot in climate, the more emotional they tend to be. And so I was trying to understand that what is the basic differences in behavior. So when I designed this chart of emotional reservoir of trying to understand the basic differences between blacks, white, and Asians, I discovered that black Africans who evolved in tropical Africa were more genetically emotional than Europeans and Asians. And Europeans are more emotional than the Asians who live further away from the equator. What is emotion? To define emotion, according to the Latin word emotere, which means energy, emotions is energy. And there's only one place on earth where this energy is many or in abundance. And that place is Africa. For some reason, the energy present in Africa, you can't find it anywhere else. The intensity of the solar radiation in Africa, you cannot find it in other places on earth. That intensity is what contributes to many habitats in nature that we find across the continent of Africa. When you look at many animals that you find in Africa, it's impossible to find it anywhere else. Then the question is that what makes this animal to reside in Africa and they cannot live in other places like Europe or Asia? What I've come to understand is that these animals live in a tropical environment. In other environments like that of Asia and Europe that are cold in climate, animals like elephants, they cannot survive in such environment. And when you really come to understand why is it that Africa has so much of abundance of resources in terms of natural resources that other countries or other continents across the world have less of resources. The reason is because Africa has a higher intensity of solar radiation. So basically, the sun is more present in Africa than in other places. And that is what generates a lot of these resources that we find in Africa, from gold, diamond, the list goes on. Africa is a continent of resources from the beginning of time. And I've always questioned that how does this intensity of solar radiation affect the humans that live in Africa? Well, from the physical appearance of blacks, that due to the solar radiation that is present in Africa, not just gave Africa the abundance of resources or the animals that lives in tropical environment of Africa, but also altered the genetics component of the people who live in that environment as well. The difference between blacks and whites and Asians is that when you look at the skin complexions, that Africans have a darker skin complexion. And what I mean darker skin complexion, this darker skin complexion also varies between countries and countries depending on the intensity of the radiation in those countries. Let me make a quick example. If you go to a country like Nigeria, for example, you find there are light, dark skin people, there are darker skin complexion kind of people in northern part of Nigeria. In the southern part of Nigeria, you have a light, dark skin people. When you go to a country like Senegal or Sudan, this complexion between the Nigerians, although even the darker part of Nigeria, which is the northern part of Nigeria, is quite different from those of Senegal and Sudan, because those people from Senegal, from Sudan, have even a darker skin complexion than the Nigerians. And when you go to places like South Africa, for example, the South Africa have a light skin complexion than most people from Senegal or Sudan. And when you go down all towards places like Ethiopia, Somalia, you find that the lighter this complexion is. Then the question is that how does this complexion varies between countries and countries? What I discover is that the closer people live to the equator, the darker the skin complexion. The further away people live away from the equator, the lighter the skin complexion. So if we go back to the previous episode I did about the history of evolution, Charles Darwin, we can understand that the European that live further away from Africa or further away from the equator, or in an environment whereby there was a lesser intensity of solar radiation. So as a result of that, the lighter the skin complexion they tend to have. Even the Chinese, who evolved even in an environment that is even colder than that of European, they even have a lighter skin complexion. And then if we have to then study in behavior, why do behavior also varies between countries or between continents? What I discover in Emotional Reservoir is that Africans that evolve in Africa, as a result of this high intensity of solar radiation, their genetics and DNA was also altered as a result of this high intensity of solar radiation than those of Europeans who live further away from the equator. So what do I mean? So let's make an example for people who don't understand what I'm trying to convey. If we are to release a radioactive bomb, a nuclear bomb in a particular area, those who live closer to that area will be the one that will be affected the most by this radioactive bomb. If we release an atomic bomb in places like Great Britain, for example, anybody who live around the areas of Great Britain in that geographical environment will be the one that have their DNA their genetics, their physical appearance affected the most. And those who live further away from radioactive bomb explosion have lesser impact. So what I'm trying to say here in emotional reservoir is that because the solar radiation that is present in Africa, the intensity, those who live below the equator, which is countries like in sub-Saharan Africa where you have more dark-skinned people, their genetics and DNA has been altered as a result of the solar radiation, the intensity of it. So those who live further away from this particular area tend to be of a lighter skin and tend to absorb lesser of the solar radiation. This solar radiation, the side effect is that what it does is, according to my study, African people absorb more of this energetic radiation that comes from the sun, making them more genetically different than Europeans and Asia. When you look at Africans, according to many Western psychologists who have carried out studies between race, they discovered that Africans baby develop sooner than white babies. They discovered that Africans have stronger bone than whites. They discovered that Africans have higher testosterone than white. They also discovered that Africans are more emotional than white. I think from that research, that's when a lot of Western psychologists concluded that maybe intelligence can also vary. But what I'm trying to focus on in this episode is the emotional reservoir, how emotions vary between blacks, white, and Asians. And this emotion comes in different forms. When we look at in the areas where black has succeeded in terms of using their intuition in professions, you can see that black have been very successful in the areas of music, entertainment, sport. I said that before in my previous episode, because though we know there's these differences between blacks and white, the Western psychologists weren't able to understand what causes these differences. And that's where Osaro theory comes in. Because when I carry out this research, I wanted to really understand what causes these differences. Is it true that black actually were born special than European or Asian? No. The idea is that this emotional reservoir is the major factor that makes black differ from white and Asians. The word emotional reservoir is a concept I coined as a way to able to understand the intensity of emotion, which I published in Osaro Theory, and is that Africans have a higher density of emotion. That makes them more emotional than European. Because European who evolve further away from Africa, they have a medium density of emotion, making European lesser emotion than blacks, but even more emotional than the Asians. And the only way we can explain this is by using the emotional reservoir chart to understand these differences in emotion and behavior. So, that is the overall view of the differences between blacks and whites in behavior. Because when you carry out a lot of studies between these differences in black, white, and Asians, you will also discover that there are certain illnesses or sickness that pertain to a certain group of people than others. There are certain diseases that are very common within the white demographic or the Caucasian. You don't find it within the Asians. And there's a lot of illnesses and disease that hit or affect the Asians more than they affect the Europeans. Also, the diseases that affect the Africans are slightly different from what affects Europeans. For example, heart attack. Heart attack is a very common disease that affects Africans everywhere on a global scale. Heart disease and heart attack affects Africans from ranging from African America all the way to the African Caribbean, to the African Haiti, to the African Brazilians, to the African in Africa, affect all black. Hypertension is the same. High blood pressure is the same. This disease affects very few amount of white Caucasian or Asians in particular. The question is why? Why does a certain disease affect certain group of people and doesn't affect others? The reason is that once we start understanding these biological differences between blacks, whites, and Asians and understand what causes these differences, then we can start answering some of the questions that we have always asked ourselves for decades. The only way we can find out is basically to understand that we are different. Not different in terms of our humanity, different in terms of the geographical environment where we evolved made us different. Black Africans are different from white due to the environment that the Africans evolved. Whites are different from blacks due to the environment where whites evolved. Asians are different from whites. And once we start understanding these differences in environment and these differences in behavior, these differences in genetics, then we can start to attribute it or pertain to a certain group of people. Why do certain people behave a certain way and others don't behave that same way? Why do certain people have a certain skill or trait that you don't find in other races? Like in my previous episode, I talk about how black people dominate sport. Why? The only way we can answer that is to understand these differences amongst races, that Africans are slightly different from white. Does that also contribute to differences in intelligence? That can be another debate, but there is likely that we already understood that these differences are caused by environment. And once we can accept that environment triggers certain human features, then we can understand why certain behavior develop, and that can help us to answer some of the scientific questions that a lot of psychologists and scientists they've been wondering and be searching for the answers. Why are we different? And that is where we're going to look into in my next episode, where we're going to be talking about these differences and how we can use our understanding of these differences to maybe create the pathway and start building the foundation of understanding the African behavior through the lens of emotional reservoir, and which can help us to create the foundation for an African psychology. Because once we understand that African behave different than European, that statement in itself is an introduction to a new window that we have to start questioning why African behavior slightly differ from European, and how we can understand these differences in African behavior. So that's why I'm thinking that Hope Osaro Theory becomes the answers to those questions, that Africans are different. And the only way of understanding these differences is to study African environment and how this evolution play a big role in the behavioral differences between blacks, white, and Asians. And hopefully that lead to us answering some of the questions that psychologists they've been wondering and asking themselves for many decades now. Are we really different? Is it about nature versus nurture? Or is there really in intelligence differences between blacks and white and Asian? Those are the questions psychologists we have to answer. I hope that Osaro Theory opened that door to those questions and able to answer it in terms of creating the new African psychology to help us to understand African behavior from the perspective of Africans, 100%. and to understand that we are different due to our environment and what our environment has contributed to our DNA and what our environment is telling us about ourselves. Maybe it's about time that we start taking in all this information and to use it to understand why we are different as a race and why we need to have a debate, a dialogue about the future of Africa in terms of the psychological aspect of Africa. And that's my hope for the future. But once again, I thank you for listening. And my name is Efosa Osaro. And I hope you have a nice day and goodbye for now.